Hi, good afternoon, all. My name is Aaron Sohaski, and welcome to Understanding and Navigating the Student Debt Crisis, brought to you by the Young Lawyers Division. We are so happy that you were able to tune in with us this afternoon to talk about the number one issue that affects young lawyers across the country. Today, I have the pleasure of being the moderator, and I am joined by a group of esteemed panelists. Again, on behalf of the Young Lawyers Division, Chris Brown, and all the other senior leaders, we are so happy that you are joining us today. Whether you're a young lawyer, law student, or more seasoned attorney, we invite you to be a part of this conversation and certainly ask you to engage in the Q&A function throughout the presentation. We will take those questions in turn, and then at the end, we hope to have a discussion about the hot topics and issues around student debt. So we welcome you to engage throughout or save your questions to the end, whatever makes most sense for you. But right now, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our faculty for today. And in alphabetical order here, I have Nancy Conneely, who is the Director of Policy at AccessLex Institute. As the Director of Policy, Nancy is responsible for advancing AccessLex's legislative, regulatory, and administrative policy goals that further access, affordability, and the value of legal education. She generates policy analysis, develops policy positions, and oversees the organization's #MakeTheCase advocacy campaign. Prior to joining AccessLex, Nancy was the manager of federal and state policy at the National Center on Time and Learning, where she advocated for more and better learning time for students attending low income and low performing elementary and secondary schools. Nancy holds a BA in sociology and psychology from Stonehill College in Easton, Maryland, Massachusetts, and a JD and certificate in law and public policy from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Nancy, for joining us today. Abre is the health directing attorney for the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley, where she leads litigation and advocacy regarding health equity and social determinants of health that impact historically excluded communities across Silicon Valley. Previously, Abre worked at the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, and on Capitol Hill. And she also serves as the elected assembly clerk for the American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division. And this year she will ascend to be assembly speaker, the chief policy officer of the YLD. Thank you for being here, Abre. Chad Christensen is a project manager for the law school survey of student engagement. In this role, he leads daily operations and works closely with law schools to encourage exploration and use of the LSSSE results. Prior to joining there, Chad devoted more than a decade to student affairs work as a strategic manager for graduate and professional degree programs. And during that time, he focused on enrollment management, professional student engagement and success, and organizational strategy. Chad has earned a PhD in higher education and student affairs from Indiana University and an MA in English from the University of North Florida. Thanks for being here, Chad. And then last but not least, we have Kyle Fry. Kyle Fry is the Assistant General Counsel at a multinational human consumables and animal nutrition company. He's also serving as the Vice Director of the Student Loans and Financial Wellness for the ABA YLD. So Kyle is my partner in crime this year. And then he also serves as the secretary of the Iowa State Bar Association Young Lawyers Division and chair of the Iowa State Bar Association's Innovations Committee. Kyle is a graduate of Drake University Law School and has a BS from Iowa State University. Kyle is also co-authored or has served as contributing author on multiple white papers discussing ways in which the costs of legal education can be lowered. And again, my name is Aaron Sohaski, and I am this year's ABA YLD Director of Student Loans and Financial Wellness. And in my day job, I serve as the Director of Contracting and Compliance for Henry Ford Health System in Detroit, Michigan. I will serve as a moderator today, but I just want to briefly go over our framework. So we are going to kick things off with Chad, who's going to give us the historical perspective, the past 15-year landscape. Then we're going to transition it over to Kyle, who's going to talk about the recently published 2020 YLD report on student debt. And then we're going to talk about what the YLD is doing to address this through Abre and her team. And then lastly, we are going to scale up and scale out and give a more national perspective of what AccessLex is doing to impact the political landscape in this space. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Chad.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and hope you're having a great day. Today, I'm going to talk about a report that we published just a few months ago on some law student debt trends from 2004 to 2019. So it was a 15-year retrospective of LSSSE data. If you're not familiar with LSSSE, next, the Law School Survey of Student Engagement was created in 2004 out of Indiana University, the Center for Post-Secondary Research there in the School of Education, to measure student engagement at law schools. And student engagement is this broad brushstroke of that really is a practical representation of decades of research on what matters most in college, what leads to student learning and positive student outcomes. And of course, my little puppy will start barking. Next slide, please. Excuse me one moment. Now, if my children don't run upstairs, we're really doing well. So next slide again too, please, Aaron. So as I mentioned, we started in 2004. Since that time, we've had 203 law schools participate in LSSSE, and we've gathered over 380,000 student responses. Each of you got a response rate of about 50%, which really from a survey research perspective is very good as far as reliability and validity of data. Annually, we have 70 to 80 schools participate each year. And so today I'm going to talk about just a couple of the questions that are on the survey. Primary one being this one right here. How much educational debt from attending law school do you expect to have upon your graduation? So as you can see, in order to account for this inherent imprecision of having students think about their future law school debt, because these are current law students and 1Ls to 3Ls are included in these responses, we have the response options appearing on the survey in these $20,000 intervals. Up to 2005, 2006, we went to more than 120,000. After starting to look at some of this data, we realized we had to increase that range a bit though. Next slide, please. Thanks. So as you look here at the bottom, we've got expected debt in 2004 of students that owe more than 100,000, 18%. And that has increased significantly in 2019 to 39%. You'll notice that there is a slight decrease from 2014 to 2019, and that theme continues throughout this presentation and our research. So I think 2015, 2016 seems to be really the highest point as far as that. It has only dropped a couple points though since that time. Interestingly enough, in 2004, 11% of respondents said they had no debt graduating law school, and that's actually increased to 18% in 2019. And I'll get into that, why that may be in just a moment. Next.
Chad, we do have a question here from Elizabeth asking that, is this all student debts or is this just law school education related debt?
Excellent question. It's a law school related debt. Yep. We asked specifically about the law school. Great question. An important one. So when we looked at affiliation, and by the way, so for these 4 years, there's about 72,000 responses um, from 2004 through 2019, those 4 years of data that I'll be looking at. So as you'd expect, certainly higher proportions of students attending private law schools expected debt over $100,000. So from 2004 to 2019, it doubled from 22% to 46%. It's also interesting to note that in 2004, only 5% of LSSSE respondents expected to owe more than 100,000 from public law schools. And that's essentially quintupled to 27%. So I think overall the trends highlight and illustrate just how higher cost of attendance has driven larger proportions of LSSE respondents to expect larger debt. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here's where it gets disheartening, I think, is more than appropriate term for it. So you see, as we look at these 4 years, in 2004, there's virtually no racial or ethnic disparities in debt expectations. Everything is tightly clustered around 20% mark. However, by 2014, that is no longer the case. The disparities are more intense, and closer to 60% of Black and Latinx survey respondents expected to incur more than $100,000 in student loan debt, compared to around 40% of white, Asian American, Native American respondents. So we see a very significant increase there. Again, from 2014 to 2019, we're seeing a slight decline, but for the Black and Latinx students, it's just a couple points. It's not as dramatic. It's still just, I mean, vastly disproportionate percentage that expect to owe more than $100,000 of student loan debt. Next slide, please. Great, there's a lot going on here, sorry. And on the left-hand side, there's the 2004 data, and on the right, it's 2014 data. I'm just breaking this out by race and gender. And the big takeaway here, I think, is if you incorporate this race or gender variable, you'll see that higher percentage of women than men within each racial ethnic group report borrowing more money. And so 2014 is obviously the highest peak, but if we go to the next slide, you'll see even the difference between 2014 and 2019, that Latinas and Black women are more likely to borrow over $100,000, and previous research we've done over $200,000 than men of the same race, ethnicity, or women from any other background. So again, there's some vast disparities here, and I'll touch on kind of, I think, some of the reasons that might be. Next slide. Great. And so one of the things I think you'll find see here is that a lot of this could be tied to LSAT. Okay, so if you take a look at the differences, now this is from 2006 to 2016. And in 2016, we started to look at scholarships, both merit and need-based, and was the first time we actually asked that question. So this data is from a different 10-year period. But you can see that there's clear associations with respondent LSAT scores and expected debt observed over this 10-year period. And so for purposes of simplicity, much of the analysis here is just presented in this higher LSAT, lower LSAT binary. So here, LSAT, score of 156 or above is the higher LSAT, and 155 or below is the lower LSAT score. You know, interesting enough, in 2006, I mean, it's the same proportion of students that expect to owe more than 120,000. By 2011, we begin to see this upward trend, and by 2016, you know, that number of the lower LSAT scores has more than doubled, and it's more than double the higher LSAT group that expect to owe over 120,000. And the next slide, you can see the disparity is even greater for respondents with LSAT scores of 145 or below. Again, you see in 2006, it's almost dead even. And now 52% of folks that are in the lower LSAT group, this time 145 and below, expect to owe more than 120,000 compared to that 20% of the higher LSAT group. And a lot of this, and I should also note that, we looked at the increase of folks that are expecting no debt when they graduate, and the proportion of students that are expecting to be debt free are the ones with the high LSAT scores that are likely to graduate. Next slide. I think some slides were missing, but what I'll say is that, what we're finding is that in 72% of all respondents in 2016 received some kind of aid. Of the students that received a financial aid package, 79% of them were merit-based and 21% were need-based. So it was a much more proportion of need-based aid in 2016. And you can track the LSAT scores from the lowest scores to highest almost in just a perfect line, where the students that are with the highest LSAT scores are getting, obviously the greatest funding, but this also creates a problem for students that from with lower test scores, which it's well documented that standardized tests, including the LSAT, folks do better if they come from more affluent backgrounds and have social, cultural, economic capital to prepare for the LSAT score and to have the support, and they're more likely to score highly on the LSAT score. So students that come from lower income background by a disproportionate amount, which would be students of color, first generation students, they all will have lower test scores. And I had slides here showing this, but then that also means that those are the students that are not getting merit-based scholarships and they're taking on more and more debt. And I mean, if you look at on this side here, the students that have LSATs of 145 or below, research shows that these are also the students that are less likely to pass the bar and who might be taking on some of the greatest debt and burden. So I think that it's a problem that really we need to continue to look at and to see how we solve, because arguably the students with the least financial need tend to get the most financial assistance from law schools, which is exacerbating the extent of student loan reliance by those with the most financial need. And so, and though there's a slight dip in this trend, it's not significant, and it's, I think, something that needs to be addressed. So I'll stop there. I'm sure I've overdone my time limit anyway, and I will pass it to fellow panelist Kyle to talk about the great survey and research they did this year on the YLD.
Thank you, Chad. So before I start, I do have to start off with the same disclaimer everyone has heard a few times at this point. Any views I expressed during the presentation do not belong to my employer, they belong to me. So with that, I'll go ahead and start. So while Chad touched more closely on the macro view of the data, I'll look more at the targeted view based on the information that the YLD received in response to the survey that was put out last year. So for those that are unfamiliar, in March of last year, the ABA YLD and the ABA Media Relations team published a survey requesting responses from young attorneys related to debt loads obtained during law school. In response to that, there were 1,084 people that completed the survey and provided responses, and we'll go through those responses during my portion of the presentation. I will say March 2020 obviously was not the greatest time to publish a survey, but nobody knew at that point in time what was going to happen. We did not know that we'd all still be living with masks, we'd all be socially distancing, that we would be living through our screens. And so while we saw some data and some response suggesting that there was some significant coronavirus impacts to borrowing and largely the earnings afterward, we don't have any good data on that, and it's likely it'll take some time to get really good data on that moving forward. However, as you can see, the information that we obtained largely tracks with LSSSE, but is still staggering for those that are young professionals within the legal field. Next slide. All right, so what did our survey actually show? So of those that took out loans, or those that attended law school, 95.2% of people actually took out loans, the remainder did not. And what you'll see here on the right is the questions, or the response to the questions of those people. What was their loan balance at the time they finished their undergraduate degree? What was their loan balance at the time they finished their JD? And what is their current loan balance? Obviously, you can see all of those numbers continue to increase, which is one of the first things that stuck out to us. Next slide. I'm sorry, I can't see the slides. Okay, my apologies. So this slide demonstrates really the percentiles of loans that students and respondents have taken out upon graduation. You can see obviously there's a pretty steep increase until you get to the 99th percentile, which is not to be unexpected, but you can see the 50th percentile is $160,000 of debt at graduation for young attorneys. Next slide. This slide shows the undergraduate loans, JD loans, and the loan amounts at graduation for broken down between male and female respondents. And so you can see really the big change is in the JD loans to the loans at graduation. You can see that for some reason, the amounts owed flipped about $7,000 between men owing more at the time they take loans to the time of graduation, the differential. Now, we didn't explore what the reason for that differential was. There could be a variety of reasons out there that existed. There could be higher borrowing on one side, tugging it down. There could be lower borrowing on the other side, pulling it down. I think the biggest differential might show is the percent who borrowed at undergraduate. You can see there's a difference of about 5% between men and women who borrow to cover their undergraduate degrees. And that's probably the difference why you start to see that upward tug on the loan amounts owed by women at graduation. Compounding interest obviously has a significant impact. Next slide, please. So this slide depicts whether, as of the date of the survey, the respondent loan amounts had changed. So let's remember the population surveyed here. They were young attorneys, ranging from first year out of law school to 10 years out, the YLD's population. So you can see the percentage of persons who did not borrow is low. Based on gender, it's roughly about 5% male, 4.7% female. You can see that as of the date of the survey, the people that owed a lower amount as of the date of the survey compared to when they graduated is ranging from 41 to 46%. You can see the people that owe roughly about the same is anywhere from 9.5% to 12%. And you can see the people that now owe today more than when they graduated is about 40% between the genders. Next slide. And so this slide is really the aggregate of the prior slide. It shows the combination of male and female borrowing. You can see the numbers are just smoothed out. It did cut off a little bit the low end, the no loan side, but you can see about 5% of people did not borrow and all the way up. I won't rehash these numbers. We showed them on the last slide. Next slide, please. So this slide depicts the amount owed proposition based upon graduation. So for those graduating after 2018, you can see that for the most part, you wouldn't expect to see a lot of them owe a lot more at graduation. You can see some owed less, some are we're about in the middle, and I suspect the reason for that is because we captured a lot of fairly new graduates. For those graduating between 2014 and 2017, the amount who owe the same as when they graduated has shrunk, while the population, or the proportion of persons who owe more has actually grown, which I found striking and against what young lawyers are generally told in terms of will we be able to pay those loans off fairly quickly. And lastly, for those who graduated prior to 2014, people like myself, you can see that there was really just a hollowing out of the middle, and the amount of people who now owe more than when they graduated is roughly the same amount as those who owe less, which I found to be one of the more striking pieces of data that was pulled from the responses to the surveys. Next slide. So this is just a different way to depict those amounts owed. The orange line is the amount owed at graduation. So this is just a graph of the responses. And the blue line is the amount currently owed. And I think we missed some opportunity here, and that's no fault of the YLD, nobody else. We did not honestly expect to see results on the right side of this curve as stark as we did, that there was a large significant amount of people that owed more today than they did at graduation. Next slide, please. So the next thing we looked at was what the impact was really beyond graduation. So you can see that there was a checklist of options that people were given as to things they had deferred, delayed, or otherwise life decisions that had been impacted by their loans. So you can see people chose not to take vacations, not to buy a house, not to have children, not to buy a car. But you can see that a lot of these are things that are important to not just young attorneys, but important to moving careers forward. Choosing a different career path, for example, about a third of people indicated that they would be in a different career path today if they did not have the loan rate that they do. Next slide. Can you go to the next slide, Aaron? Oh. Next slide. I think there's another discrepancy here. Keep going. I'll tell you when to stop. After that. All right. So I found this personally to be the most frustrating slide in the data that we got. So you'll see here the loans at graduation based on the respondents ranked from highest mean loan amount at graduation to lowest. And you can see that people who are Asian or identified as Asian or Pacific Islander borrowed the most, and 90% of them borrowed. People who are Black or African American borrowed the second most, and 99% borrowed. You can go all the way down to people who identified as white or Caucasian borrowed. I will say, for those that sort of find this information frustrating and think that there's more that can be done on this, I would say that the two best resources on this, one is Chad's LSSSE group, and the other one is Law School Transparency. But you can see there's a large discrepancy in the amount of money borrowed based solely on race, and then there's some potential socioeconomic status issues in there as well that were not surveyed. Next slide. Okay, so we concluded the slide the survey with open-ended responses that allowed people to just type in whatever they were feeling. If there's additional information they really wanted the YLD to know. I won't read all of these. There were hundreds of these that came in. Not all of them were worthwhile, but a lot of them gave some insight as to really the current mental state of young lawyers. And you can see the responses here. A lot of them are disheartening and just dire. Like I said, I won't go over them, but this is a cultural phenomenon that young lawyers generally will have to move forward with together. We'll have to find a collective solution, and we'll have to try to find a way to improve both the profession for ourselves and those that come after us moving forward. Next slide. Okay, so this is a follow-up to the last slide, just provides more information for the open-ended questions that we asked about mental health. Again, I'll pause here for a brief second before we transition to Abre, I believe, to give her overview of what's next, but I did want to again stress the dire nature that we have as young professionals facing a lot of things that those who came before us didn't. I mean, for a lot of us, none of us have known a world where there isn't a recession or there isn't something major going on in our lives. And so collectively, we're going to have to figure out how to solve these issues. Abre?
I found my slides. Yep.
Yeah, those aren't mine.
Hey, Erin, are you able to share your screen and the slides?
Can you see my screen here?
Okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about what this looks like within the ABA YLD, and then also kind of taking a little bit of a step back as to why the conversation around student loan debt and student debt in general is something that we care a lot about within the ABA for a number of reasons. One, it being that we, within the ABA YLD, really try to make sure that a lot of our work is around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and conversation around student debt is definitely one that has, for the implications that we've heard from many of the speakers who presented before me, it has racial disparities and disproportionate impacts on people of color, specifically Black folks and Asian Pacific Islander folks as well. Next slide. So the ABA YLD has an assembly. And so for those of you who may not be as familiar with what assembly is, that is our body where we basically pass resolutions to talk about what's important within the American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division. And so there's young lawyers from all across the country who are voting on policy matters. And then sometimes the policy matters that come through our assembly, our policymaking body within the Young Lawyers Division, will also be voted on at the ABA House of Delegates. So sometimes there are things that come up in the ABA YLD, it'll pass ABA YLD, and then it'll move to the House of Delegates, depending on what kind of resolution it is. And sometimes, depending on the urgency, there may be votes that happen during council as well. And so we can figure out kind of the timing for whether or not something has to go to the House of Delegates. And then just in general, student debt and education loans and bankruptcy are priority areas for the ABA YLD. And these are areas that are being considered either in the kind of consent agenda kind of phase, but are being considered by the delegates who are a part of the ABA YLD. Next slide. So what in general we're kind of, what we've looked at is, and like I said before, there are resolutions that are basically voted on, and they're either debated or they're part of the consent agenda. If they're a part of the consent agenda, that means that there won't necessarily be conversation about it, but they are resolutions that the delegates within the assembly felt didn't actually need debate, but that they approve of those resolutions to either, for ABA YLD policy. And so one of the resolutions that passed through the consent agenda, well, will pass through the consent agenda, is that we're urging Congress to enact legislation to amend U.S. bankruptcy code to permit student loans to be discharged in bankruptcy without proving undue hardship as it's currently required. And so the Young Lawyers Division is sponsoring that, but there's also additional sponsors like the Law Student Division, the Standing Committee on Paralegals. And this is something that Counsel also talked about several months ago, so back in November of 2020. And then additionally, we are looking at urging Congress and the executive branch to develop and implement programs to assist lawyers experiencing financial hardship due to their student loan obligations. And so that's something that we're sponsoring. Law Student Division is sponsoring the Standing Committee on Paralegals. And so these are conversations that within the YLD that we're having, and that our delegates, they're crafted by delegates within the Young Lawyers Division, and that the Young Lawyers Division has stated that we support. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. So just kind of generally, actually taking a step back from law school loans, but general debt, Black student borrowers are twice as likely to not be able to repay their student loan debt as white borrowers. So as we saw in previous slides, in addition to, Black students being almost 100% likely to actually take out that debt, they're twice as likely not to be able to repay it off. And there was conversation in our previous presentations about like, how do we get there? But I also, and we're in the midst of Black History Month, want to take us even a further step back. So Black codes were things that were laws that were actually put in place after the end of slavery to ensure that Black people would continue to be working for either free or very cheap labor. So we can see from the inception of this country, the way that work was considered distributed and the individuals who were able to be paid for that work was never really a system that was implemented and meant for Black people to succeed in. Then once, kind of the Black codes were considered unconstitutional and were ruled out, redlining came around. So as many of us may know, being able to invest in housing, being able to invest in actual property is a way to build wealth. And because of redlining, Black people weren't actually able to build wealth in the same way as non-Black individuals when it came time for buying houses, because there were actual places in a city or places in a county where Black people could not actually purchase homes because of redlining. And then because of the Fair Labor Standards Act exemption for domestic, agricultural, and service occupations, we continue to see that there were a number of Black people who were being left out of the conversation when it came to, who was going to be able to benefit from the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so in addition to kind of all of these things, we continue to see the racial wealth gap continue to expand. Black students are less likely to be paid as much as their white counterparts, and still in 2021, Black women are making 63% of what white men are making for the same job. So even when we're talking about, okay, we want for people to be in the same job, the student debt crisis in and of itself is just exacerbating these issues for people of color, for Black individuals, and for other individuals who have been historically excluded from conversations when it comes to building wealth. And so the debt is just compounded because of all of these reasons. Next slide. So even though we are pursuing these opportunities now as it relates to education debt and student loan debt, and are showing our support, this is not necessarily a new concept for the ABA YLD. The ABA YLD has supported many policies that ensure that our constituents within the ABA YLD are considered when it comes to student loan debt. So I listed a few of them actually on this slide. So around public service loan forgiveness, financial counseling, extending student loan repayment terms, corrections to loan forgiveness programs, and urging Congress to amend the IRS code to allow for full deduction of interest paid on student loans. And so this is just kind of showing the history of not only are we showing our support now, but the ABA YLD has been very consistent in demonstrating our support for understanding the intersectionality of student debt with our particular constituents and understanding that it's a social justice issue. Next slide. So just kind of taking a step back, specifically relating to the debt crisis resolution and the bankruptcy resolution. In order for those resolutions to become policy, ABA YLD policy, they have to pass the ABA YLD assembly. Like I said, they're a part of the consent agenda. Assembly is actually going on tomorrow. And so the consent agenda will be approved at ABA YLD assembly tomorrow. And then resolutions can be, but they aren't always, passed to the ABA House of Delegates after passing an ABA YLD assembly. So the ABA YLD policymaking team will have conversations with HOD, with our liaisons kind of within the HOD, and we'll figure out whether or not a resolution, if that resolution is something that makes sense to actually go to the ABA House of Delegates as well. And those conversations often happen with the drafters of those resolutions for consideration, and there may be some changes from time to time as well. Next slide. So for the House of Delegates, what happens if it's actually submitted to the House of Delegates, Rules and Calendar Committee, they will review the submission. Like I said, they may have edits, they may have some changes. The comments are typically sent to the drafters and the policy team for those changes. And if folks are interested, they can watch the House of Delegates and see what happens with those resolutions that we move from the ABA YLD to the House of Delegates to see if it becomes ABA policy in addition to it being ABA YLD policy as well. That's it. Thank you. I think it's going to Nancy next.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thank you to all of my co-panelists for teeing up the problem. So if you could go to the next slide. What I'm going to talk about is actually what might be done about it, and what might Congress do. So I'll talk about what they're going to be focused on this term. I want to touch on AccessLex Institute's higher ed policy priorities, and then finally, I want to talk about ways in which you can get involved. Next slide. So first and foremost, Congress is going to be focused on COVID relief. What that means is that other priorities and other things on Congress's to-do list are going to get pushed back into later in the term, but that doesn't mean we won't see changes to higher ed through this process, as we have already seen through the CARES Act and other COVID bills. So the president indicated that he wanted to do this next COVID relief bill in a bipartisan way. He and his staff had some meetings with a bipartisan group of senators and representatives. However, it quickly became clear that the two sides were very far apart. They couldn't agree on what was going to end up in that bill, or what the price tag of that bill should be. So that signaled to Democratic leadership in Congress that they should use this quote unquote fast track procedure called budget reconciliation. I'm not going to dive into budget reconciliation. It's very sort of arcane and wonky, but there are two things to know about this. The first is that it only requires 51 votes in the Senate to pass. Other legislation requires 60 votes. Because Democrats effectively have a 51 vote majority, with Vice President Harris being the tie-breaking vote, if all Democrats sort of vote together on this COVID relief bill, they can pass it. The other important thing to know about budget reconciliation is that it is very limited in terms of what you can include. So policies in a budget reconciliation bill have to affect the federal budget. So they either have to be related to mandatory spending, revenues, or the debt ceiling. So what that means is that what can be passed through budget reconciliation for COVID relief may not be the same as what Congress could do through regular legislation. So there may be sort of gaps in terms of what they want to pass and what they want to do. So right now, Congress is working on their COVID relief bill. They hope to get it done by March 14th, because that's when unemployment insurance runs out. And we've already seen language, and for higher ed, it would include about $40 billion to be included in the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. This was a fund created by the CARES Act last year. Now, after they pass this budget reconciliation bill, we expect them to do a second budget reconciliation bill, or at least try to. We think that bill is going to be a little bit broader in scope, and may include things that some might say are indirectly related to COVID. And so for higher ed, that could mean things like debt cancellation. It could mean increasing the Pell Grant. It could mean free community college, which is one of the president's priorities. And so, there are things that they can do with just Democrats through this budget reconciliation process. But like I said, since there are gaps, the president may decide that he's going to use his executive authority to do some other things. I mean, we just recently saw him use an executive order to, extend the moratorium on foreclosure and evictions. So I'm going to pause here and talk a little bit about debt cancellation, since it's relevant to this panel. We've seen a lot of push and pull in between Congress and the executive branch around this. The president has said that he is supportive of canceling $10,000 in student loan debt, and that he would be happy to sign any bill that came across his desk that did that. On the flip side, Democrats in Congress are saying, we want $50,000 in cancellation, and actually we think you should do it, President Biden, which is an interesting dynamic that, the president's trying to defer to Congress and Congress is trying to defer to the president. You don't often see that. But I think what that speaks to is Congress may not feel that they have the votes to do this, even through budget reconciliation, which only requires 51 votes. I think they may be worried about getting moderates on board for that. And so for the president to do it, it would take that out of the equation. But what the president has said is, I don't think I actually have the legal authority to do it. I think only Congress can do it. And just yesterday, the White House said, we are going to ask the Department of Justice to research this and analyze whether or not the president can do this. So I say all that to say, stay tuned. We may or may not see some action on debt cancellation this year. If you could just advance, I think there's one more thing. Yeah. So Higher Education Act reauthorization is another thing that is important to pay attention to when it comes to changes to higher ed and student aid that could help borrowers and students. So for those of you that aren't familiar, the Higher Education Act is the federal law that governs the federal student aid programs and other pieces of higher ed. Typically, bills are reauthorized or rewritten every 5 or 6 years. HEA actually expired in 2013, so it's about 7 or 8 years overdue for reauthorization. And a lot has obviously happened in the last 7 or 8 years. There are a lot of changes that desperately need to be made. And so even though Congress will be primarily focused on COVID relief, I do think that you will see the education committees at least start to work on these bills. And so as I'm going to talk about in a minute around advocacy, it is really important to get in to talk to, or I guess in this case, with COVID, call or email, don't go in person, but call or email your members of Congress before they start putting pen to paper, right? So, now is the time to talk to your representatives and your senators about what you would like to see or what you think needs to be in a Higher Education Act reauthorization bill. And so I don't know how far they'll get because I don't know how much time they'll have. We don't know how much time COVID relief and these various bills will take, as well as other priorities, right? There's been talk of immigration, there's been talk of infrastructure, perhaps healthcare. So we don't know where this will land. The other important thing to remember about HEA reauthorization is that unlike budget reconciliation, which only needs 51 votes, an HEA bill needs 60. So in the Senate, those 50 Democrats would have to get support from at least 10 Republicans to pass a bill. So again, it remains to be seen whether or not that will happen this term. Next slide. So I think you have to just keep advancing. There you go. So these are sort of the buckets in which AccessLex Institute's priorities sit. So I'm just going to run through them quickly. So the first is increasing affordability. So some of the things that we support and that we are advocating for with Congress is, decreasing or lowering interest rates on federal student loans, as well as eliminating origination fees, which are the fees that the federal government basically just like takes off the top when they give you a loan. Around supporting diversity and access, we would like to see students who are eligible for Pell Grants to be able to use any remaining eligibility to pay for graduate school. So right now you could get up to 6 years worth of eligibility, but if you finish your undergrad degree in 4 years, you would have 2 years of eligibility remaining. So we think you should be able to use those Pell Grants for grad school. Also, we'd like to see subsidized loans reinstated for graduate students. These are loans that up until 2011 were available to graduate students, and therefore students who demonstrate financial need. And the interest on these loans are paid while you're in school and during your grace period. These were eliminated for graduate students. And what that means is that we sort of ran some numbers and it tacks on an additional $3,000 to $4,000 for students having to pay that interest on unsubsidized loans. And then finally, on diversity and access, we would like to see Congress fully fund HBCUs and other minority serving institutions. They wrote into the 2008 Higher Education Act certain thresholds of funding, but they have never actually met those thresholds in their spending bills. And we'd like to sort of hold them to that. As far as strengthening repayment goes, we would like to see the income-driven repayment plans streamlined, sort of simplified into one plan. There are currently 5. And we'd like to see some changes made that would make it easier for students to enroll in these programs, but also stay enrolled. And then also under this category, we want to see some improvements made to the public service loan forgiveness program. People just a couple of years ago started being able to apply for PSLF, and what we have seen is an incredibly low approval rate of only 1%. And so clearly there's a lot of room for improvement, and we'd like to see Congress make some of those fixes. Regarding improved consumer information, we would like the Department of Education to release better data that can be used by students as they're making decisions about where to go to school and which programs to enroll in. And then also we would like financial aid administrators to be able to increase the frequency of loan counseling, which they're fairly limited in right now. And then finally, we would like to see some changes to the bankruptcy code that would make it easier for student loan borrowers to have their student loans discharged. Next slide. So, there is a lot going on, but I view that as an opportunity, right? So, you've got an opportunity with COVID bills, you've got an opportunity with Higher Education Act, perhaps some standalone bills like we saw in the last Congress. So, what can you do? I often hear from people, well, I'm not a lobbyist. I don't advocate for a living. I don't know how to do this. But what I will say is that you are a constituent and that matters. So reach out to your members of Congress, call them, email them. They want to hear from constituents and they want to be responsive to constituents. And so educate them about what the issues facing your community are, whether they're COVID related, they're specifically student debt related, whatever your issue is, educate them about it. And what's important here is to the extent that you can, make the connection to your state or local district, right? Because, they often hear about these problems at the national level, but the more you can tie it to their seat, in other words, the state or district, the more receptive they will be, right? Because they'll say, oh, this is an issue impacting my constituents. And also, if you can bring both data and stories, they really work together in a powerful way, because the data shows that there is a problem, right? But the stories bring that data to life. And if you can do both, that goes a long way. And then, don't just tell them what the problem is, but come with the solution, right? And I say that for a couple of reasons. One, you want to present them with the solution so that you are sort of pushing them in the direction that you want to go in, or making sure that the solution fits what you think is best for stakeholders. But also, these Hill staffers have wide portfolios of issues that they're dealing with. So when you talk to an education staffer, they're not just focused on higher ed. They're not even just focused on education writ large. They might have, labor issues, workforce issues, healthcare issues, criminal justice issues. Their portfolio is wide. And so they can't always become experts on every issue. And they don't always have the time to put into, okay, how can I fix this problem? So if you bring the solution to them, you've sort of done half of their job for them, right? And it doesn't have to be legislative language. You don't have to, write the bill for them. But even if it's just sort of high level, this is what Congress could do, or this is what a solution looks like, you've really helped them sort of get to the finish line. And they're going to appreciate that, and they're going to sort of view you as a resource, which is incredibly important. And so if you don't know where to start, what I would say is, check out AccessLex's Make the Case advocacy campaign. The website is right there on the slide. We have resources that you can use. They're free. Anybody can use them. Share them with your friends. And so we've got fact sheets on specific issues, loan counseling, PSLF, et cetera, to sort of get you up to speed on the issues, but also to share with your members of Congress. We've got some tip sheets that, give you tips on how to be an effective advocate. And then I think the most powerful tool of all that we have is one where you go in and you enter in your name and address, and it will bring you to these pre-drafted emails that we have created. And, it's issues that we are currently advocating for, but you can edit them. You can put in your issues, your stories, things like that. And once you hit send, it goes directly to your members of Congress's education staffers. So we have tried to take a lot of the work out of it for you. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, but I just encourage you to reach out to your members of Congress and make your voice heard.
Well, thank you so much for that, Nancy. Really appreciate it. And we have a great question here from Marina. And if you could just give your response in 20 seconds or less, and then we'll do a quick wrap because it's nearing the top of the hour. So you mentioned 1% of PSLF applications are being processed through successfully. Can you give some of the reasons why 99% are not being accepted?
Yes. So PSLF has a lot of eligibility requirements. You have to have the right loans, be in the right repayment plan, and have the right employer. And you also have to have paid for 10 years. And so a lot of people aren't meeting those. They have the wrong loans, they're in the wrong repayment plan, or they haven't made 120 payments yet.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And so thank you all so very much for joining us again today. I did put up our website that we have dedicated that was launched in late 2020. It's ambar.org/debt. You can take a look at the 2020 student loan report that Kyle spoke about. all the advocacy issues that Abre mentioned that we are working towards, as well as any sort of webinars, stories, articles, recent publications that really feature the ABA and all the work that the YLD is doing. Again, a huge thank you to all of our panelists today. The slides that were presented today, I know we had a few technical difficulties, so we'll work to make sure that we have the right order when we send out all those slides to you, but each of you will be receiving the slides. And again, we wish you all very safe and well rest of an ABA mid-year meeting. Thanks, everybody.